Cobham is on just about everyone's list as one of the top 100 drummers of all time, any genre. Jazz, rock, you name it. Best known, of course, from his groundbreaking work in the 70s with Miles Davis and the Mahavishnu Orchestra, and on several solo projects since then, and in many, many, many studio situations. He's the subject of a new book by Brian Gruber called 6 Days at Ronnie Scott's Billy Cobham on Jazz Fusion and the Act of Creation.
What inspired me to write a book about Billy Cobham? We met about 7 years ago in France and then became very good friends and began to not only see his shows all around the world, but also get to know him and hear his stories. And every time I got together with him, he told more extraordinary stories that really represented to me a panorama of the last half century of American music. So finally, I just said, we've got to get these stories down. He told me he was going to do a 6-day run at Ronnie Scott's, where Guy Barker, a prominent British arranger and trumpet player and impresario, arranged and orchestrated Bill's music for a 17-piece big band. So to 6 nights of shows at the iconic jazz club Ronnie Scott's in London, I went backstage and interviewed him and other band members and critics and club owners, and then made phone calls to people from Randy Brecker and Jan Hammer to Ron Carter, and got to know people who had been working with Bill all throughout his career. So for me, the book is about this extraordinary creator's life, and the fact that I was so curious why someone who was in effect a rock star with Mahavishnu Orchestra would choose, without being able to write music at the time, to write a full album of music for Spectrum, which became, of course, a smash crossover hit. And why is he still creating, to this day, writing new music at the age of 74? What drives people to continue to create, and what is it about the act of creation, if you will, that motivates and inspires people? So interviewed a number of people about that, but mostly it's the only full-length, long-form, unexpurgated story of Bill Cobham, and it's done in the form of oral histories, so you can hear people tell stories in their own words.
You know, Brian, the Mahavishnu Orchestra was my gateway to jazz. Billy Cobham, of course, was a prime member of that groundbreaking and short-lived group. Does his fusion work bring others into the jazz tent, as it were?
Mahavishnu Orchestra was also my gateway to jazz, and I remember as a boy being introduced to music that I would otherwise not have listened to. So there's no question that jazz fusion in general introduced new people to jazz, and even those who are not fusion artists, like Ron Carter in the book, talk about how it helped to expand and open what the concept of jazz was. And it even, Ron made an interesting comment that it brought a certain sensibility that every time you perform live and in public, you need to deliver a certain high-quality experience to people. So the Mahavishnu era definitely brought the genre to a whole new group of people, and I think particularly even for those for whom Mahavishnu was a little esoteric and not that accessible, Bill's work, starting with Spectrum, with the groove that it laid down, allowed people that much more access to the art form. So there's no question that for a whole generation or several generations of rock and rollers and others, this opened a whole new world for them.
Well, it's no secret that jazz was born in America, and probably no secret to anyone that hardly anybody listens to it in America, at least when you're measuring by record sale. Less than 5% of record sales, when there was such things as records and record stores to measure, make up jazz sales in the U.S. Europe, Japan, and elsewhere always seem to hold jazz in much higher regard than America. Now, your book references Billy during his gigs in England, not the U.S. Why do you think America continues to mostly ignore its very own art form?
Jazz used to be pop music in America. And finally, in the 50s and 60s, it was supplanted by rock and roll and then other forms and genres. So jazz, through its evolution and through innovative breakthroughs with people like Billy Cobham, has remained relevant to this day and still has a tremendous worldwide audience. But many artists like Billy Cobham and Chet Baker moved to Europe partly because they felt that they can have a freer form of expression there. And there was more opportunity and more appreciation. And as Bill said in the book, he just didn't want or wasn't interested in a Billy Cobham disco era. He wasn't interested in emulating that. So that was part of the decision for Bill. And certainly jazz continues to be both associated with the United States and also a driver for new genres and new art forms.
So how do you think that ultimately Billy Cobham's music will be remembered?
How will Bill's music be remembered? I asked that question of a number of people. Mike Hobart, critic for the Financial Times, talked about Bill's place in the jazz firmament, as he called it. And for many of the people who I interviewed, from club owners to jazz critics to musicians, Bill not only transformed their musical careers or their appreciation for music, but will be remembered as one of the greats, and probably in the genre of jazz rock fusion will be considered the most influential and creative drummer. And by the way, still doing it now. He just had the Crosswinds tour, which, as you know, had an electric bassoonist on stage, Paul Hansen. So always new stuff and new experimentation, even to the current day. And the book explores a lot of what happened in the United States through the 60s and early 70s, and how music was such a big part of the revolutions and political, social, cultural attitudes. So for me, there are several storylines running concurrently in the book. 6 days backstage at Ronnie Scott's to see how Bill does load in, doing it all by himself physically, of course with some help, but being hands-on and picking up gear and putting it together and constructing his kit on stage. So 6 days backstage with an insider look at how band leaders like Bill and Guy Barker change what they do from day to day based on what's happening on the stage. And overlaid on that 6 days of conversations and musical experience are 6 decades of Billy Cobham's musical life, including those extraordinary times in the late 60s and early 70s when Miles Davis and John McLaughlin and Larry Coryell and the Brecker brothers and so many others, almost all of whom played with Bill, transformed how Americans looked at music.
Brian Gruber, author of Billy Cobham on Jazz Fusion and the Act of Creation. I'm Ken Hunt.